Hello and welcome to this edition of Wineskins. I'm Father Jim Korda. Wineskins is a program that features reflections on the lives of the saints and the sacred scriptures, along with a variety of issues and topics, all from a Catholic perspective. Wineskins is brought to you through the annual Bishop's Appeal, the Catholic Communication Campaign, and St. Paul's Catholic Books and Gifts, a division of the Society of St. Paul. On our program today, I will interview Msgr John Zuraw on child sexual abuse. We will also hear more information on Blessed James Alberione, and today, as the Church celebrates a 33rd Sunday in Ordinary Time, we will get a deeper insight into those particular Sunday readings. That and more on Wineskins. In our current issue segment, I will speak with Joan Lawson. Joining me now is Joan Lawson, who is a consultant with the Religious Education Department for the Diocese of Youngstown. Welcome to Wineskins.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Joan, while you're somewhat new in the position, you're not really new in the diocese because you've had lots of ministry performances and occupations and jobs here in the diocese. For the folks that are with us to get to know you a little bit better, tell us about some of that ministry that you've been involved with over these many years.
I have been very blessed to be in several parishes in the diocese, at St. Paul Salem, at St. Brendan in Youngstown, briefly at St. Michael in Canfield, and then most recently at Immaculate Heart of Mary in Austintown. And they were all wonderful people to be with, and I consider myself very privileged and blessed to have been able to be in those places.
Were they the same kind of ministry that you were doing, or was it different types of jobs?
They were essentially the same in that they were about religious education and pastoral services and liturgy. So all of them had parallels, although took on different flavors depending on the parish.
And now in the diocese as a consultant, tell us exactly what a consultant's job is.
The Office of Religious Education supports lifelong faith formation. As a consultant, I support that and help develop courses and formation opportunities for adults all over the diocese, and especially support parish ministers in developing programs, processes for religious education of all people, and most especially of adults.
We're going to talk a little bit more in a moment about those people who are working in parishes in religious ed, but before that, you mentioned that word lifelong. So we get this sense sometimes that someone just goes to CCD class and that's it. But that's not the way it is with us as Catholics. It's a constant learning process. Why is that so vital to our faith?
It's absolutely essential for us to continue to mature in our faith. Even when you think about how our reading cycle during Mass goes, where we have the same readings every 3 years, and sometimes you're sitting there thinking, have I really heard this reading before? And it's because you're a different person than you were 3 years ago. And we need to develop our learning, our understanding, our knowledge of our faith in the same way. We're different. As we mature, we have different experiences, and we need always to be developing that to deepen our relationship with God through Christ.
Let's talk about those people who are in the fields, in the parishes that are working in religious education. What are some of their duties, and what do we need to be aware of that they bring to church?
They bring so many gifts, such dedication, and such a love for the people. And that's really from cradle to grave. And so people in religious education and in other pastoral ministries in our parishes are working with preschoolers, with school-age children, with youth, with young adults, and with mature adults to strengthen their ability to live their life in faith, hope, and love.
It's interesting, over these 40 years for me in church as a priest, I've come in contact with a lot of wonderful people in religious education, and they bring their own really personal life and faith into their work, into their job. And every one of them has been different, but the constant has always been their commitment. And why is commitment so important when we're talking about the life of the church?
I think it has to do with the authenticity, that people are looking for someone to help them in their faith lives, and the person who's doing that has to be living the faith authentically, or it isn't meaningful, and the people are just dedicated.
What would you tell the folks that are with us about the office downtown, the religious education office downtown? What do you want them to know about you?
Well, we provide services including networking for parish ministers, formation for parish ministers, and also that we really support lifelong adult faith formation. And part of what we do is provide a library that has printed resources, recorded resources, digital resources that help people in all areas of their faith life, in knowledge and understanding, in their prayer life, their spiritual development, in liturgy, in service, all that makes a fullness of being a Catholic Christian.
And if they want to get in contact with the Diocese Religious Education Department, what do they do?
Well, they can certainly call us in the diocesan offices, and they can also email us. The Office of Religious Education has a wonderful website called Catechist Cafe, and it's at catechistcafe.weebly.com. And we have all kinds of categories of topics in parish ministry and in our faith life, scripture, saints, seasons, that can get them into the resources that we have.
Well, Joan Lawson, it's been a pleasure to have you on Wineskins and also to learn more about what you do for the diocese as a consultant in a religious education department, but also thank you for your commitment and lifelong faith that has nourished and enriched our own church.
Thank you so much. It's been a blessing to be with you.
For Wineskins, I'm Father Jim Korda. Blessed James Alberione was the founder of the Society of St. Paul. To tell us more is Pam Pasquale. She is from St. Charles Church in Boardman.
Father James Alberione, founder of the Pauline family, was born in Italy on April 4th, 1884. At the age of 16, James entered the seminary of Alba. On June 29, 1907, he was ordained a priest. During his time as an assistant pastor, he met a young Joseph Giacardo, his future helper, now Blessed Timothy. Father Alberione had come to understand that the Lord was guiding him as a young priest toward a new mission, to preach the gospel to all peoples in the spirit of St. Paul, using the modern instruments of communications. Thus, on August 20th, 1914, Father Alberione initiated the Pauline family in Alba, founding the Society of St. Paul. With the help of the young sister, Teresa Merlo, they began a second congregation the following year, the Daughters of St. Paul. Having already begun the magazine, The Pastoral Life, for parish priests, he eventually began the weekly magazine called The Christian Family, striving to nourish the Christian life of families. The goal that Father Alberione wanted his spiritual sons and daughters to pursue above all else was complete conformation to Christ and his way of life. His ultimate goal was to have them embrace the whole Christ way, truth, and life with one's entire being, mind, will, heart, and physical energies. Father Alberione died at the age of 87 on November 26, 1971. In his last hours, he was comforted by the visit of Pope Paul VI, who had never hidden his admiration and veneration for him. James Alberione was declared blessed by Pope St. John Paul II on April 27, 2003. Pope John Paul II pointed out the relevance of the life and apostolate of Blessed James Alberione at the time of his beatification, when he said, "Blessed James Alberione felt the need to make Jesus Christ the way, the truth, and the life, known to all people of our time with the means of our time." As he liked to say, he was inspired by the Apostle Paul, whom he described as a theologian and architect of the Church, remaining ever docile and faithful to the magisterium of the successor of Peter, a beacon of truth in a world that is so often devoid of sound spiritual references. May there be a group of saints to use these means, this apostle of the new times was in the habit of repeating. What a formidable heritage he left his religious family. May his spiritual sons and daughters keep intact the spirit of their origins to respond adequately to the needs of evangelization in the contemporary world. The opening prayer of the Mass reads, Lord God, who raised up in the Church Blessed James Alberione, your priest, to proclaim your Son as the way, the truth, and the life, through the many forms of communication, grant, we beseech you, that we may follow his example and devote ourselves to preaching the gospel to all the nations. For Wineskins, I'm Pam Pasquale.
Joining me is Msgr. John Zuraw. Welcome back.
Thank you, Father Korda.
I think in this segment, what we'd like to talk about is that Virtus policy that is presently utilized here in the diocese. Let's go back prior to that, and what was the original protection policy?
In 1994, there was a policy created child abuse. And then a year later, it was renamed child protection. So there was wisdom in changing the name. What the diocese then created was a program called Treasure's Gift from God. And that had various educational components. There was a video about how we educate young people. There were various segments and various workshops that were created so that educationally prevention would be in the forefront. Then in 2016, the bishop decided, along with other bishops, that Virtus should be our platform for child protection. And Virtus is internationally known. It is used in a multitude of dioceses. And the beauty is that as people transfer from one diocese to the other, they have an opportunity to then transfer their Virtus account with whatever job they're doing in whatever diocese. Prior to Virtus, you needed to take that over again. So that's one of the positive aspects of Virtus. It's internationally known. Individuals see the two components of the educational component and the prevention. The Virtus is a 2.5-hour session in which there are two remarkable videos that are shown. And the beauty is that there are actual offenders that communicate their own story, indicating to the audience, how did they groom the children? What particular ways did they entice the children in allowing them to victimize these children? So that is the educational component for us, so that we who are in ministry or volunteers or employees of the diocese, if we see this happening, then that should bring forth a red flag in our minds, and then the opportunity to confront the individual with the situation.
So it sounds like Virtus is more comprehensive
Correct.
Than the original policy. Where does the word Virtus come from? Is that just the nomenclature of
It is
the
just the
program?
nomenclature.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit more about the importance of education. Education not only for us professionally in the diocesan church, but what about education for those families or parents who might be suspicious or have some desire to learn more about the situation?
Right, and I think that's a great question, because a lot of our families with younger children, they automatically go into the mode that this is sex education. And it is not sex education. It's dealing with enhancing what is good touch, what is bad touch. What are the boundaries that individuals should have? And once those boundaries are crossed, then the responsibility, and especially young children, to tell either parents or an adult that, individuals were crossing boundaries, and, to make us more aware of the surroundings that our young people now, in fact, live in.
And I think this is a complex and complexing world that we live in. And so that brings me to my question about how are we as ministers, as professional people, to act in the church, not just us priests, but those employed in church service.
In the diocese, right. There are statistics out there that say 1 out of 10 young men have been victimized 1 out of 5 women have been victimized. Now, the victimization might not only be sexual, but it is through improper touch, through suggested behavior. And I think the important aspect is we as clergy or employees or volunteers need to be aware of our behavior. And, what might have been proper behavior 5 years ago is not proper behavior today. Individuals might have put hands on the shoulders. Individuals might have been given other individuals a hug. Well, in today's society, we need to even be aware of what we do and how individuals interpret what we are doing. We might have every good intention, but for some individuals, it might be unwarranted.
Sure. Let's talk about that word credible. We use it in another segment. What do we mean by credible? And is it opposed to an allegation?
Right. Credible, basically, when cases are investigated, there is a reasonable proof that actually it did in fact happen. Now, sometimes what happens is, especially when names have been brought forward of our deceased priest, how can we articulate that this is credible? Because it is one person's word against a deceased individual. And the diocese, through its investigative avenues, have to look at what is going on, and they have to articulate, to the best of our knowledge, the facts seem to articulate that it is more truthful than not.
Let's talk about that word laicization. We know that some of those priests who were credibly accused have been laicized. What do we mean by laicization?
Well, laicization is that the individual is returned back to the lay state. And this is a process that is done through the Holy Father. That in the diocesan role, our canon lawyers work to get all the situation mapped out, the facts mapped out, and then they send it over to Rome, and Rome makes the ultimate decision as to whether or not the individual is returned to the lay state. We saw in recent times the Ted McCarrick situation, where not only was he removed from the College of Cardinals, but then eventually Pope Francis laicized him, so he no longer is able to function as a priest within the church.
For more pertinent information and to listen to Wineskins, visit www.doi.org, the website of the Catholic Diocese of Youngstown. Stay with us. We'll be back in a moment.
Hi, I'm Mark Quinn. As I grew up on the south side of Chicago, the Dominican Sisters of Springfield not only taught me, but formed me in my Catholic faith. I owe them so much. That's why I make an annual donation to the Retirement Fund for Religious. Do you remember the religious men and women who shaped your life? Say thank you to them by donating to the Retirement Fund for Religious at your local parish. Join me. Share in the care.
Church World Service believes that being self-reliant is a joy everyone should share. So around the block or around the world, share the joy.
Our song today is from the CD called Worship the Lord.
Let me see the world through the eyes of Jesus. Let me hear the cries of the people lost in sin. Let me feel the touch of the hurting reaching out for hope. Let me see
And now I'll share some insights on the readings for the 33rd Sunday in Ordinary Time. Seeing is believing, right? Not always. Look closely at a glass of pond water. It looks perfectly motionless until you put it under a microscope and see all of the hundreds of organisms that are there. Things are not always what they seem. See the person with a beautiful smile, surrounded by friends and supported by great wealth? They must be happy and content, right? Maybe not. That person may be isolated and lonely. Things are not always what they seem. In today's gospel, Jesus cautions his disciples to be aware that appearances are often deceiving. To accomplish this, Jesus set his remarks on the last days. Jesus extended the vision of his disciples across the expanse of time, to the end of time. Only then could they see reality from God's point of view. Jesus reminded his disciples that the permanent is often temporary. As Jesus walked with his disciples to the Jerusalem temple, they were impressed by its size and beauty. It was an architectural wonder. King Herod spent over 40 years building it. But Jesus said that the time would come when every stone of that edifice would be thrown down. Such a statement seemed blasphemous. Today, a large mosque stands over the very site of that temple. Herod's temple was destroyed by the Romans just 40 years after Jesus made his prediction, and Rome itself was destroyed a few centuries after that. Don't be too impressed with the permanence of human handiwork. The Tower of Babel, the unsinkable Titanic, the technological marvel of the space shuttle, all too soon our idols crumble to dust. Human institutions, governments, and powers are equally as transient. At their peak, they seem eternal, but they are merely the brief colors of autumn leaves before winter. Faith will last much longer than human authorities. Love always outlasts hate, and life always rises above death. Are you discouraged by the current political scene? Are you made anxious by the volatile economic markets? Are you opposed by the strength of evil persons? Are you tempted to join them? Take heart, Jesus said. Take the long view. Time is always the enemy of falsehood and the friend of the truth. Remember, God controls the clock. Abraham Lincoln once said, "I would rather suffer defeat in a great cause, which would ultimately be victorious, than to experience victory in a cause that would ultimately prove to be failing." How much more so for Christians? Jesus tells us that those who stand alone for him are never really alone. Your stand for righteousness might seem to be solitary. Family and friends may betray you. You may even lose your life for it all. But remember, you will not die alone any more than you will live alone. When you take a stand with God, you stand with the saints of all ages past. You stand with the angels and with God Almighty. You are not alone, and the end is not the end. Your faithfulness in God and your faithfulness to God will not protect you from cancer or hurricanes or persecution, but it will protect you from the greatest loneliness and greatest danger of all, separation from God. Since we know how history will end with the triumph of God, let us not be anxious when the forces of evil seem to prevail. The game is not over. God's time is not expired. Remember, things are not always what they seem. For Wineskins, I'm Father Jim Korda. Hope. It is perhaps one of the greatest gifts that God has given us. May we celebrate that gift each day and every day within ourselves and within all God's people. Wineskins is a production of CTNY, the Catholic Telecommunications Network of Youngstown. It's brought to you by the Annual Bishop's Appeal, the Catholic Communication Campaign, and St. Paul's Catholic Books and Gifts. I'm your host, Father Jim Korda, wishing you a beautiful week.
What have you done for your marriage today?
I gave my wife a hug this morning. I told her I love her.
I did her hair this morning. I think it looks pretty good.
I cooked my husband's favorite breakfast.
I bought her an orchid.
What have I done for my marriage today? I sent my husband a love email.
I read the newspaper to my wife, and it cracked her up. But she's still laughing.
What have you done for your marriage today? Make a change for the better. Need help? Go to foryourmarriage.org, a message from the Catholic Church.
They say America is the land of opportunity, but for some, life isn't so easy. Right now in America, 1 in 6 children lives below the poverty line. That's nearly 13 million children of all races, all across our country. Where do you draw the line and get involved? You can make a difference in more ways than you think. Go to povertyusa.org today, because 1 in 6 children in poverty is one too many. A message from the Catholic Campaign for Human Development.